Welcome everyone to this session on the Joint Standing Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. I am the session moderator, Jane Drake-Brockman, Director of the Australian Services Roundtable and co-convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition. I'm also industry professor with the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide and a member of the G20 Trade and Investment Research Network. So I am a services stakeholder. And like the thousands of stakeholders that come every year to the WTO Public Forum, I always come, like all of us, in the expectation that this event might deliver opportunities for consultation and networking and improve transparency, finding out a bit better what's actually going on, because after all, outsiders to government never see any negotiating text. And finally, we come in the hope, for those of us that still believe in the multilateral trading system, that there might actually be some outcomes, some negotiating outcomes. Well, this panel has some very exciting negotiating news updates to share publicly with you all today. Our first speaker is Jaime Cogui Arias, Deputy Head of the Delegation of Costa Rica to the WTO and Coordinator of the JSI on Services Domestic Regulation. I'm very tempted to, but I will not steal his thunder. Over to you, Jaime.
Jane, thank you very much for your introductory words and for the invitation to participate at this very important and timely public forum session. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you today to give you an overview on the ongoing negotiations in the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, which I have the honor of coordinating. These negotiations over the past 3 years have progressed steadily and have attracted an increased number of WTO members across all regions of the world. This is why this process is now looked at as one of the WTO negotiating issues most promising for delivery by the next ministerial conference, which as you will know, will take place at the end of November this year. In the coming 10 minutes, I would like to address 3 main points. First, I would like to explain how the issue of services domestic regulation is addressed by the Joint Initiative, and in particular, how an initiative's outcome on this topic would look like. Secondly, I would like to inform you about the current status of the negotiations, including the most recent developments from the last initiatives meeting, which took place just this Monday, 27 September. Finally, I will provide you with an outlook on the next steps that the initiative will take to arrive at the finalization of this negotiating process in time for the ministerial conference. Before going straight to the substance, let me pause for a second on what we concretely mean when we talk about services domestic regulation. For services business who want to export abroad, it is sometimes challenging to find out about the requirements to obtaining a license, and often there is no one to turn to for requests for information. When suppliers file their applications, they are at times left in the dark as to how long processing times will be and by when they can expect approval of their application. Sometimes obtaining information about the status of applications or even whether such applications are complete or have been rejected is difficult to come by. In some places, documentation requirements are excessive and burdensome and still relying on paper rather than electronic means, or original documents rather than certified copies. And it's therefore not surprising that business from both developed and developing countries have voiced their concerns on requirements and procedures that regulate their access to services markets. In a nutshell, what business have long been demanding are transparent, fit-for-purpose requirements and procedures, which minimize the unintended consequences of regulations in services sectors. Now that we have clarified what are the problems that can be linked to the domestic regulation measures, let me move to the questions of how these issues are addressed specifically by the Joint Initiative. The disciplines developed by the initiative respond broadly to business needs expressed under the following 3 pillars: transparency, legal certainty and predictability, and regulatory quality and facilitation. On transparency-related matters, WTO members will be required to make available all the information needed by business to comply with requirements and procedures for authorization, including on, for example, authorization fees, contact points, licensing criteria, and technical standards. In addition, members will have to respond to inquiries by services suppliers through appropriate mechanism. And finally, the disciplines aim to improve the involvement of suppliers in the regulatory decision-making process, which are called for publication of draft laws and regulations and establishment of opportunities for interested suppliers to comment on such proposed measures. Under the pillar of legal predictability and certainty, the discipline's objective is to ensure minimum warranties to be followed by relevant authorities during the licensing authorization process. As you can see from the screen, this includes several elements such as indicative timeframes for processing applications, information on status and decision on applications, and the possibility to resubmit applications in the case of rejection. Finally, the disciplines also aim to improve the regulatory quality of services markets and facilitate trading services, including by encouraging members to accept electronic applications and authenticated copies of documents, and requiring the independence and impartiality of regulatory authorities when dealing with authorization applications. The regulatory disciplines that the initiative has negotiated over the past 3 years are contained in the reference paper on services domestic regulation. What is important to note is that the reference paper provides for certain built-in flexibilities that aim to preserve space for differences in WTO members' regulatory capacity and approaches to services regulation. I will come back to the reference paper and its content in a moment, but what I would like to highlight is that the reference paper is only just one of the two main components of an initiative's outcome. To give concrete legal effect to the reference paper, participating members will inscribe it in the respective services schedules so that the disciplines on services domestic regulation will apply horizontally to all the sectors committed therein. This is indeed what our minister had instructed us to do through the joint statement issued in Paris in May 2019, while taking stock of the great progress the initiative made in the 2 years since its establishment. Participating members committed to continue work on services domestic regulation with a view to incorporating an outcome in the respective schedules of specific commitments by the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. Now that I describe what form an outcome on services domestic regulation will take and what is the initiative's working objective, I would like to inform you about where the negotiations on the first component of the outcome, the reference paper, stand and what is in it. Just 2 days ago, on Monday, 27 September, the initiative held its first, and let me say, very successful meeting after the summer break. Thanks to the flexibility and pragmatism demonstrated by all participants, the initiative was able to resolve the remaining outstanding issues in the reference paper. So I'm very pleased to inform you, and this is the very first opportunity I have to share the good news, that the negotiations on the text have now come to a conclusion. The reference paper on services domestic regulation is now available as an unrestricted document accessible to all on the WTO website. What you will see when you will skim through the reference paper is that it's composed of 3 main sections. Section 1 covers issues related to the scope of application of the disciplines and scheduling modalities. Another very important aspect of this section pertains to the flexibilities provided for developing country members participating in this initiative. First, developing economies can delay the application of specific provisions in sectors in which they face implementation difficulties. The use of transitional periods can aid them to make any necessary adjustments to their domestic regulatory frameworks. In addition, least developed countries deciding to join the initiative will integrate the disciplines into their GATT schedules only when they graduate from LDC status. At that time, they can then designate any necessary transitional periods if they require. Finally, developed and developing country members in a position to do so are encouraged to provide specific technical assistance and capacity building to developing and in particular LDC members upon their request on a mutually agreed terms and conditions. Now, Section 2 and Section 3 is where the substantive disciplines are contained, while Section 2 provides for horizontal disciplines applicable to all services sectors. Section 3 contains alternative disciplines specifically for commitments in financial services. Given the very particular nature of this sector, participants have agreed to provide an option for members that may need so to subscribe to a slightly less ambitious set of disciplines. But let me say that the substantive difference between Section 2 and 3 are minimal. One substantive paragraph that Section 2 and 3 have in common is the discipline on non-discrimination between men and women and in authorization procedures for services suppliers. You can see it on the screen now. The reason why I'm mentioning this discipline specifically is that this will be the very first time that the WTO outcome contains such a provision. The initiative is indeed firmly convinced that this provision represents a concrete way to support women's economic empowerment, especially during the post-COVID economic recovery. We have now reached the last point I would like to address in my presentation, namely, what are the concrete next steps that the initiative will take to arrive at finalizing this negotiating process in time for the ministerial conference at the end of November. Based on the conclusion of the negotiations on the text reference paper, as coordinator of this initiative, I have suggested that the group works towards the preparation and submission of services schedules incorporating the disciplines by the end of October. As I have just said, a package of schedule by participating members is a fundamental component of an outcome on services domestic regulation, because only through schedules the disciplines will be given legal effect. The ministerial conference itself will be an opportunity for the participating members to declare the conclusion of the negotiations while taking note of the reference paper and schedule submitted, as well as to provide guidance for the start of certification procedures in 2022. At present, there are 65 members participating in this initiative, and they represent above 90% of world services trade. Just last week, Singapore announced its decision to join the group. But as we rapidly approach the ministerial and the contours of an outcome on services domestic regulation become clearer and clearer, many other members have already indicated an interest in this process. Let me conclude with on a few key messages. As you can see, the negotiations are substantively at a very advanced stage. Domestic regulation is, as I'm sure most of you will have heard already, one of the most promising prospects for delivery by next WTO ministerial conference. The participants are convinced that an outcome on services domestic regulation is an outcome for business, because services suppliers will be those who will benefit from the enhanced transparency, legal certainty, and predictability, and ultimately the greater regulatory quality and facilitation that the disciplines seek to establish. When they trade within markets of members who adopt the disciplines, services suppliers will all equally enjoy the benefits deriving from the implementation of these disciplines. What does it mean in practice? It means better access to services markets and new export opportunities. It is clear a result on services domestic regulation will not break new ground, but will have a concrete impact on the operations of service suppliers and the performance of services sectors, and for that reason constitute an important building block in the post-COVID economic recovery. I believe, and all the members in this initiative do as well, an outcome on services domestic regulation will not only finally provide a long-time due response to business needs, but it will also renew energy in the multilateral trading system and the WTO as a negotiating forum. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jaime, and thank you to the hardworking Costa Rican delegation to the WTO. On behalf of all private sector stakeholders, frankly, whether from industry or academia or the NGO community, let me say thank you for the foresight in delivering for the public forum exactly what all stakeholders want. That is an unrestricted document available to us to read, and a negotiating outcome, bravo. And on top of that, if things go well between now and the ministerial meeting, it seems from what you have told us that the WTO will be proclaiming before the end of this year the first WTO text, which formally commits to no discrimination between services providers, whether they be men or women. I mean, this is going to take a minute to sink in, I think. Let me repeat this. It really looks like we're about to see commitments on non-discrimination between men and women written into WTO schedules. It's worth a moment's recognition and a virtual clap. Our next panelist is John Drummond. He is the head of the Trade and Services Division in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD, where he leads the work on services trade, including the OECD Services Trade Restrictiveness Index and trade policy making in the digital economy. John, we know the OECD has been doing the numbers and knows what this deal might actually mean in terms of real trade and economic impact, and why it's such an important ingredient in rebooting trade and services for post-pandemic recovery. Do you have the floor? We're keen to hear.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jane, for the introduction, and thanks to you and Pascal for organizing this session with Jaime's news. It's really extremely timely. And I have to say, it's nice to be back in room W to see some meetings and some people in person, and hello to everybody joining online. Jaime and I spent an awful lot of time here as services negotiators way back during the Doha round. And when I think back on that time, maybe I should start with a bit of a confession. I have to say that during all my years as a delegate in Geneva, the meetings on services domestic regulations were by far the most painful that I participated in. There's no offense to Marcus here for all the hard work and organization he's done all this time, but it was painful to brief upwards to senior officials and ministers, because very often services come across as too complex, too abstract, relative to sectors like manufacturing or agriculture, where the winners and losers might be more evident. It's painful to organize and consult domestically, because it's difficult to get different line ministries with different interests and different regulators unified behind a common whole of government position on trade and services. And it was painful to describe the benefits of services reforms and liberalization in clear evidence-based terms that can motivate policymakers, politicians, exporters, and the public. Good news is that was then, and we're in a better position today than we were 10 or 15 years ago. We've just heard the great news from Jaime about the progress in the negotiations. And I'm going to share some OECD research that tries to cut through the complexity, the domestic confusion, and add some clarity to what's at stake here. And I think that this is going to leave you with no doubt whatsoever about the need to maximize participation in the JSI and to bring this undertaking to a successful conclusion at MC12. So why are we in better shape today than we might have been a few years ago, and how can the JSI contribute to COVID recovery? So first of all, the last 10 years have seen great advances in data and evidence, making services trade less complex and less abstract. We have a better understanding today of how domestic regulatory environment can impact competitiveness, employment, equality, and economic growth. So for example, the work that the OECD does with the STRI, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, and compatible efforts by the WTO and the World Bank Group make it possible to compare and quantify market access and domestic regulation conditions across countries. And so for the OECD, this is based on a database of over 16,000 laws and regulations, and across 50 different economies and 22 services sectors. It adds up to about 100,000 regulatory data points, which are updated annually. Now, second, This evidence underlines the importance of an economy-wide whole of government approach to services trade policy making. You see, the impact of seemingly small horizontal restrictions are magnified across sectors, and sector-specific barriers accumulate along supply chains, adding costs and undermining competitiveness, and in the current context, weakening COVID recovery. The growing body of data and evidence makes it possible to measure the trade costs associated with restrictions to trade and services. We can therefore quantify the downsides of cross-border red tape and the gains from multilateral cooperation as sought through the JSI. I'm going to give you a couple concrete examples. I hope that this can be useful ammunition in motivating policymakers, politicians, and exporters alike. What I'm showing you here is this is how the 100,000 different laws and regulations in the OECD STRI break down between domestic regulation and market access and national treatment measures. You can see that the domestic regulations, so what's in green here, constitute a sizable share of barriers to trade and services. And any undertaking that can convert these domestic regulation measures from border bottlenecks into global gateways can significantly reduce trade costs. Can even start to see a little bit how much the gains might be. So when we compared the current levels of services trade restrictions across G20 countries, for example, this is what they would look like in terms of the reductions if the JSI was fully implemented. This slide shows the magnitude of reduced services trade restrictions by sector. We've done this for APEC economies as well and for different configurations of economies, but I'm showing you the G20 today because this is some of our new work. We can even take it a little bit further to see how the benefits even more clearly. So this slide illustrates the corresponding reduction in services trade costs would be an average of 6% reduction in costs in the G20. And when we do similar analysis for APEC economies, the services trade cost savings are closer to 8%. And finally, when we put this in the context of total trade value, we can calculate the overall trade cost savings. And we do this by calculating ad valorem equivalence of services trade restrictions through a structural gravity analysis. And what we find is that the total relief resulting from the cutback of regulatory costs for services exporters could amount to around 143 billion US dollars amongst G20 countries. That's annually. Take it beyond the G20 and you take it to all the participants, those numbers get even bigger. Similar numbers and gains for APEC economies. This is across sectors such as transportation, financial services, telecommunications, and business services, which imply follow-on gains in competitiveness, productivity, and employment across the entire economy. I should also underscore that given that exporting to new markets involves a navigation of procedural hurdles and compliance costs, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, would be the first to gain from these reforms. In fact, our calculations show that SMEs would enjoy an additional premium in terms of a 2 or 3% additional cost reductions relative to large firms. So there you have it from the OECD. We're trying to show you evidence that cuts through the complexity of services domestic regulations, helps to make the case for a whole of government approach at the national level and international cooperation at the WTO. A 6 to 8% reduction in services trade costs and almost $150 billion in annual savings for exporters and consumers is critical at this particular juncture of the COVID recovery. I think these numbers should help to convert the pain of services domestic regulation negotiations into the pleasure of boosting trade and services, strengthening the multilateral trading system, and promoting a strong, sustainable, and inclusive economic recovery. And I really commend everybody that's been working so hard to achieve these goals. Let's get the job done at MC12. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So, okay, for the G20 members alone, this deal is worth over $140 billion US drop in trade costs every single year. And as we know, trade costs in services are double those in trade in goods, and we know they've been going up, not down. And John, I think the point that you made that this relief is experienced by the services providers. These costs are particularly crippling to SMEs and micro SMEs. They're really crippling actually to the people who trade. And thinking about the Director General reminding us yesterday in the opening plenary session that trade is about people, and in trade and services, it's often about individual services providers, including more often than not in the services sector, it's about individual women services providers. And it's very important to understand that it's SMEs and other businesses that pay every single year that 140 billion in trade costs. So that's a remarkable figure, John. It's not one we are likely to forget very quickly. Thank you very much for the research. It's difficult research to convert in the field of services, the trade costs involved. We'll turn now to Marcus Giolito, Councillor with the WTO's Trade and Services Division and long-serving Secretary for the Working Party on Domestic Regulation. He is also the author of a very recent WTO staff working paper, which analyses both the prevalence of services domestic regulation disciplines in all of our RTAs and looks at the relationship between services domestic regulation disciplines and economic performance. So over to you, Marcus, to tell us both the story of your research, adding to the OECD's findings, and to explain what more you need to cover on the JSI itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for your introduction. And yes, as you pointed out, the WTO Secretariat has released a staff working paper, which is available on the WTO website. Also, just very recently, where we essentially consolidate some research that we were asked to do by a range of WTO members who have reacted to the developments in the JSI and have approached the Secretariat with essentially two requests. One, can we participate? In other words, are our own domestic regulations more or less in order to join this initiative? And secondly, can you give us any ammunition for our policymakers to show to them that there are actually economic benefits from implementing these types of disciplines? So what I want to present to you today is two questions. The first one is, how prevalent are domestic regulation disciplines in regional and bilateral trade agreements? And secondly, what are the potential benefits from implementation of these disciplines? And as John has pointed out, he has pointed out that the full implementation of the disciplines will result in considerable trade reduction. So this is already one very important economic benefit here. Let me start by presenting to you some of the findings of our RTA analysis, which covers a representative sample of 74 trade agreements concluded by 151 WTO members. And this sample includes most of the new generation agreements. So what makes our research different from other earlier research on domestic regulation is that we looked at the disciplines designed by the joint initiative very precisely, and we aimed to map out the prevalence of these precise disciplines by the most granular detail possible. So we cover essentially in our analysis all the disciplines with only 2 exceptions. One of them, the one that Jaime mentioned before, the non-discrimination paragraph between men and women, that is unprecedented in regional agreements, so there are no comparators for that. It's really breaking new ground in the WTO. Now, for the inclusion of regulatory obligation, the inclusion of regulatory obligations in RTAs is a very good indicator of an economy's capacity to apply these disciplines at the multilateral level. And this is because by their very nature, and in contrast to market access commitments, regulatory measures are typically applied on a non-preferential basis. You do not implement transparency measures limited to only a limited set of trading partners. You do this typically on a multilateral basis, on a non-preferential basis anyway. So that's why RTAs are very good proxies for the ability to apply these disciplines multilaterally. So the first aspect we looked at was implementation or development of regulatory disciplines and their inclusion in RTAs over time. So what we know, of course, is that recent RTAs have assumed a much broader scope than traditional RTAs and are going far beyond the removal of quantitative restrictions and discriminatory measures. What we didn't know before we undertook our analysis was whether this broad scope also extended to the inclusion of regulatory provisions equivalent to those in the domestic joint initiative. And what we also didn't know was when did this happen? Did this happen just now that the initiative started, or is this a longer standing practice? And I think from this chart, you can see fairly well that the adoption of regulatory obligations in RTAs is a fairly established practice by now, particularly among new generation agreements. You can see that we mapped this on the basis of some illustrative provisions that we pick from the disciplines and track over time for their inclusion in RTAs. And you can see that this practice started around 2005, then accelerated in 2010, possibly not surprisingly, because this was exactly the time when the multilateral negotiations in the WTO became deadlocked and members moved more to regional processes to harvest and advance work that wasn't possible at the WTO anymore. Since then, by 2015, 98 members had concluded an RTA with GATS plus regulatory obligations. And this figure has now risen to 112 members by 2020. And what we take from this is that members that have been increasingly willing to signal their commitment to good regulatory practice as a means to drive and spread regulatory reforms at the national level. The second question was that we posed to ourselves was whether the practice of adopting regulatory disciplines and RTAs varies between economies at different levels of income. And thirdly, whether there are differences across regions. And our analysis shows that almost 40% of the members in our sample of 151 members have adopted on average at least half of the disciplines, and only low-income economies are involved in this practice to a lesser extent. Here in the screen, you can see the percentages of members that have included specific regulatory disciplines in at least one of their RTAs relative to members belonging to the same income group. Although the practice is more significantly reflected among high-income economies, almost 2/3 of RTAs in our sample include also a middle or lower middle income country and provide for GATS plus obligations. We also examined if the practice of including regulatory disciplines and RTAs is limited to members that are participating here in the WTO in the JSI DR negotiations. And we did not expect that non-participants in the JSI would have included regulatory obligations in their RTAs. What we found, however, was that 32 non-participants in our sample signed on to at least 5 SDR disciplines in RTAs and 8 non-participants to more than half of them. Overall, our RTA analysis, which is much more extended in the paper, of course, suggests that although variations exist among RTAs in their breadth and level of ambition, the disciplines that are designed by the joint initiative reflect and consolidate a treaty drafting practice that has developed over the past 15 years. And we conclude from this that the establishment of a uniform set of obligations under the roof of the WTO will create a global baseline for good regulatory practice of services markets and has the potential of stimulating the quality and effectiveness of domestic regulatory frameworks and thereby further support international services trade. Now, turning to the economic benefits analysis. What we did then on the basis of our RTA data set, combined with applied regime data that we have in our database for 74 WTO members, this gave us a pretty good idea which members are implementing on the ground the domestic regulation disciplines already. So on this basis, we wanted to plot that information against indicators of economic performance to see if there are any associations. While John and his colleagues, through their tireless calculations, have established tangible economic gains in terms of trade cost savings, our research is not able to establish causality. We establish essentially correlations, but goes beyond trade costs and focuses on wider economic benefits. In this graph, we can observe the correlation between implementation of the disciplines and wrong slide. What you can see on this first scatter plot, and given the time constraints, I'm afraid you have to take my word for it, is a positive correlation between implementation of the disciplines and the relative size of the services sector of different economies. In other words, members that are applying more disciplines tend to have greater services sectors. We selected this indicator because services have become a key driver of the global economy. They have progressively transformed national economies on a massive scale and are the fastest growing economic segment in today's interconnected world. Services create jobs, produce an efficient allocation of resources, promote firms' competitiveness and productivity, and diversify economic output. That's why we felt that this correlation is particularly interesting. In this graph, we can observe the correlation between implementation of the disciplines and services trade by all 4 modes of supply. The positive slope of the fitted line suggests that economies with more disciplines implemented tend to be more actively involved in services trade. We picked this indicator because services trade by all modes of supply has grown faster than trade in goods and is continuing to expand dynamically. For developing economies, services trade offers opportunities to build know-how and technological capacity and achieve competitiveness at the global level. Also wanted to show you something that we discovered incidentally during our research. We used, of course, also data collected by other organizations that have developed instruments of good regulatory practice. And what I hope you can see here is that the domestic regulation disciplines by the JSI are very closely aligned with instruments that have been developed by the World Bank, the OECD, and an APEC over the last 15 years or so. And these instruments have already served as a useful baseline for many countries who in recent years have decided to undertake significant regulatory reforms with a view to improving their respective domestic business climate. And we suspect that these reforms over the last 15 years have now enabled WTO members, both developed and developing countries, to come together and produce this outcome here in the WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. It is a remarkable achievement on the part of both the WTO Secretariat and the OECD Secretariat to have assembled all of this new empirical base. It's actually very hard to ignore. I mean, Marcus Giolito has shown us that more efficient services regulation is correlated with larger services sectors, more services trade, greater integration into global value chains. John Drummond has shown us that regulatory inefficiency is accounting for roughly 40% on average of the restrictiveness in the services sector. That's an extraordinary outcome. And looking back over those slides and thinking about them, I think it was as high as 60% for telecommunications. And looking inside that 143 billion, say, that could be saved every day by the G20, I remember that something like 42 billion of that was other business services. That is that huge, fast-growing sector: professional services, R&D services, scientific services, environmental services, mining services, advertising, consultancy, management consultancy, massive sector. And if you add up commercial banking and insurance together, that's another 48 billion in financial services, and that includes the fintech sector. So extraordinary findings that show us also that there could be as big a drop in services restrictiveness as 1/4, 24% across all the services sectors. And I remember John Drummond showing us that very big improvements in restrictiveness experienced in telecoms, in computer services, in engineering services, in commercial banking. These are really very valuable new empirical results for which obviously we're all very grateful. And I don't dare count any negotiating chickens before they hatch, and I do respect the WTO Secretariat for the very informed, neutral backroom role it always so assiduously adopts. But I think the Trade and Services Division of the WTO Secretariat actually does need some recognition here. And as a stakeholder, let me thank you, Marcus, for your patience and steady hand. And let me thank the whole Trade and Services Division. So to both organizations, a very big thank you. Now, I turn to my co-organizer in this panel, longtime colleague and batting partner, Pascal Canais, Managing Director of the European Services Forum, the voice of the European services industry in international trade and investment negotiations. Both the European Services Forum and the Australian Services Forum celebrated their 20-year anniversaries simultaneously last year. And that's how many years we've been locked into close dialogue, robust debate, and joint advocacy for the services sector. So Pascal, you have the final word in this panel to tell us why this deal matters so much for industry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane. Well, I think everything has been said. So I think I'm going to join you, Jane, and I think everybody around here to thank the negotiators, and to thank Jaime and OECD and the World Bank as well for all the work which has been done. We have been working on this issue in the European Services Forum since our inception in 2000. And the first position paper with John Cook here has been about domestic regulation, because every time that we were asking our members, our companies in the services sector there trying to do international activities, they will systematically tell you that the most difficult aspect, the main barrier, if you wish, is a lack of transparency in the domestic regulation. They don't know where to find the information, or they have different information depending on which authority you're addressing to. And so these disciplines are about getting rid of the lack of transparency, and this is what we are really looking for. It is complicated because it is behind the border, and we are here in the World Trade Organization, but actually the ministers going to come here in 7 weeks are ministers of trade, and they don't look about the behind the borders regulation most of the time. So services regulation are not done by the trade ministers. They are done by the Minister of Finance, Minister of Transport, Minister of Justice, Minister of all of those sectors. And that is one of the difficulty to put the grasp on the difficulty on domestic regulation into the trade organization. Because what business need to know is how can they export? How can they establish themselves in a third country? How can they provide a service by sending on a temporary basis personnel in another country? And to get this information is really, really key. Now we're into the digital world. Also, we need to know what are the data policy requirement to export in another country without moving to that country. But how to get a license has been the major problem. Which license, which authority do we need to address to get this license? What is the process? Is there a right of appeal if the application is rejected? Is there a single entry process? What is the cost of the procedure? Because a small and medium company, if it is too costly, they're not going to go and adventure in a third market. How long is it going to process going to be? All of that is really important for a company to know. Is it possible to submit your application by electronic format? Is it possible to have these necessary documents that you have to apply can be sent on an electronic basis? For the mobility of people, where to get the visa, what kind of visa, what is the cost of that? All of that is really practical questions that our companies are willing to get. And I think finally we're going to go there. We have in ESF called many times for this WTO to adopt the domestic regulation, the disciplines on services domestic regulation. Yes, as Marcus have shown us, there are some disciplines on regulatory domestic regulation in some FTAs. And on our side, the European Union has adopted many of these disciplines in agreements like with Canada, with Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, recently with the UK, with Korea, Ukraine, etc. So that exists there, but it's one by one, it is a long process. True also that the APEC regulatory principle exists, and that is also a group of economy which are normally invited to implement these principles. The CPTPP with 11 countries do have some regulatory domestic regulation provision into their agreement. ARCEP recently also the 15 countries have also domestic regulatory principle into this agreement. So that's already good and necessary, but it is not big enough. So that's the reason why we want and we prefer to have it in the WTO. And the fact that there are already 65 countries now, if I understand well, with Singapore joining recently, is really a good signal that they finally start to understand the importance of this exercise. Because I think it is important to say here, it is really a win-win situation. But maybe also we have to emphasize that those who are not going to be part of this initiative are going to be the losers. Because if a company is looking for access and how to get access to a country and they don't find this information, they're going to say, this is too complicated. Oh, I have another country here, part of this initiative, implementing very clearly transparent principles. I'm going to go and try to do business in that country instead. So the losers will be those who are not going to join this initiative. So again,
like Jane, thank you, Jaime, thank you, Marcus, thank you, John, for all this excellent work which has been done in the recent years. The fact that you have made public this reference paper, which has been adopted on the 27th of September, I think it's really, really good, and also lack of transparency on the negotiating process is never good. So I think for stakeholders like us, when we know that there is transparency on this way of negotiating, is actually very good. Hopefully by end of September, the schedules by the 65 countries are going to be effectively tabled. But since we are in the WTO building, we are pushing to have this effectively result by MC12. I think it is really, really good that independently of the ministerial conference, the process will go on, and effectively, technically, you don't need the ministerial to have result. And I think it's important to say, but I will really, really call upon you to push your ministers to do effectively a joint statement, ministerial declaration, a sign of the WTO for this joint initiative, because this needs to be really amplified, and the minister's voice will amplify this result. So it's really important that we go to this finish line. I think the work done by John on the OECD and the work done since a long time on this services trade restriction index, I think it's a really, really good work. And we come to these disciplines because of all this background work which has done in the past, and this is adding the visibility of the need to make some progress. So I hope the ministers will call and will enjoy and will rejoin on this issue. And let's go again to the figures, because, you know, we have been used to the ministerial declaration here in this house or in other ministerial conferences in other countries, saying, great result, we have achieved a package on agriculture, reducing the tariff, and this is going to be a great result. It has actually probably never reached this figure. $140 billion per year of reduction of cost for the services, access to different market. I think it's absolutely fantastic result. It's a huge result. Ministers cannot avoid and cannot hide this. So I hope they're going to take this in consideration. And the fact that, John, you said that in this survey, you also consider that for SMEs, the multiplying effect would be actually it's maybe even more than 6 or 7%, but maybe 2 or 3% in addition to that. So really the diminution of the cost is really important. We hope that all countries will implement this domestic regulation disciplines. De facto, many of the countries are already doing that. We know that because they have committed that to the FTAs. And we only also hope that other countries will join. Other countries will join these initiatives, showing and telling them that, you know, you're going to be the loser if you're not part of it. I think that ASEAN countries, for instance, should all be in because they're already signatory of the RCEP, where some regulatory parts are already in there. I think that what you have negotiated at the end, Jaime, with this transitional period and way to get the LDC countries involved will be attractive to that. That will probably require also some efforts from the ministers to drag other countries. And I hope they're going to do that. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Pascal. Pascal mentioned that the European Services Forum was in Geneva to push for this to be part of MC12. And let me say that the Australian Services Roundtable has joined forces with them in a collective global services coalition media release for the public forum. Out yesterday, other signatories are Business New Zealand, the US Coalition of Service Industries, Canadian Services Coalition, the Hong Kong Services Industries Coalition, the Indonesian Services Dialogue, the Japan Services Network, the Singapore Business Federation, the Coalition of Services Industries in Chinese Taipei, and the City UK, all of us underscoring our support for adoption of this reference paper as a concrete deliverable for MC12. Now, Jaime, you'll be very pleased to know that people are in fact already reading the reference paper. I have a question from Hildegund Nordas. It would be, I think, for Jaime and Marcus to answer. It relates to section 2, articles 11 and 12 of the reference paper. How does the reference paper relate to the role of professional bodies, professional services bodies, especially with respect to recognition and independence? This may be our only question time is short, but Jaime, over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for this question. The disciplines themselves, they don't try to rule or make rules regarding the professional bodies, but what we achieved, it was a discipline that encourages members to support the dialogue between those bodies, if those bodies are interested in establishing dialogues on issues relating to recognition of professional qualifications. The disciplines themselves doesn't cover substantive issues. The disciplines are, let's say, for good regulatory purposes, good, let's say, good government measures. And so the disciplines themselves doesn't regulate that, but encourages members to support the work of the professional bodies in that regard. Maybe Marcus, do you want to add something on this regard?
Maybe I can take the next one, then the one with regard to independence.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So because of the specific role of professional associations in the licensing processes of professionals, the independence provision in the disciplines is cast in a way that doesn't require independence of the body itself from the decision, but independence of the decision-making processes and the administration of these processes. So that's a kind of a fine line, you know, from if you take telecommunications as an example, the telecom reference paper very successfully prescribed independence of the regulatory body because that is feasible in the telecommunications sector and very desirable. But since these disciplines apply horizontally to all service sectors, language had to be found that accommodates the specific role that professional service associations have in the licensing of professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime and Marcus. It was an important question to cover because I know we have a lot of professional bodies attending the public forum. I know that the Law Society from the UK is in Geneva for the public forum, and there are many professional bodies watching this issue very closely. So thank you. I think I really only have time to quickly ask if John Drummond would like to make one final point before I wind up. John, is there something you'd like to add?
Well, thanks very much, Jane, and thanks to all the discussion. I think the point that we'd underline from the OECD's point of view is that WTO members have a remarkable opportunity here to bring home an agreement that proposes real benefits for real people in terms of services exporters. We talk about the preparation of schedules going forward. A lot of the analysis we've done is based on an ambitious outcome. So I think that as participants are preparing the next steps, keep that ambition in mind and don't slow down as you're approaching the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a significant moment in WTO history. We are within reach of the first negotiating outcome on services since the WTO was established. It was unfinished business left over from the Doha development agenda. It's part of the built-in agenda and MFN outcome. It's now just a matter of collective political will. Thank you.